In the wake of last week's off-year election defeat, the Trump White House decides it needs to tackle affordability. Americans are now being promised $2,000 tariff checks, 50-year mortgages, and cheaper steaks. But are these policies aimed at the root of the problem, and are they likely to help the GOP soothe voter concerns?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome to Potomac Watch, the daily podcast from the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. I'm Kim Strassel, your host today, and joining me to talk about how you too can get a 50-year mortgage are my editorial page colleagues Alicia Finley and Mene Ukwe-Barua. So the reality is that the Trump team does have a few talking points in its favor when it comes to the economy. Inflation has certainly come down from at least the heights it was under Joe Biden, although it remains higher than it should be and ticked up slightly in the last report. There's some evidence gas prices have come down a little bit under Trump. Real average earnings have grown in 2025, but the reality is that Americans aren't feeling better about their situation. A recent NBC News poll found that only 30% of Americans felt the Trump administration was living up to its expectations for handling inflation and the cost of living. And that came through last week in the election, where real majorities of voters in Virginia and New Jersey made it clear they have transferred blame for the economic struggles under the last White House onto this one. In light of this, Donald Trump has been all this week about affordability, unveiling a new raft of ideas for helping cost-strapped Americans. A big one, which he put out on a tweet this weekend, promised, quote, a dividend of at least $2,000 a person, not including high-income people, will be paid to everyone. Let's listen to the president talking about it more here in the Oval Office on Monday.
And one of the things we're going to do, we're going to issue a dividend to our middle income people and lower income people of about $2,000. And we're going to use the remaining tariffs to lower our debt. We're going to be lowering our debt, which is a national security thing. So we're doing a lot of good work. And the numbers were reported so incorrectly. The real numbers are trillions of dollars have been taken in or gotten in terms of investment from the tariffs. And so if that were ever reversed, it would be a disaster. Frankly, it would be a national security problem for our country.
So, Mene, before we talk a little bit about some of the policy and political aspects of this and why Trump is doing this, my argument is that he's doing it in part to put some additional pressure on the Supreme Court, which is deciding on the legality of his tariffs. I just want to go through the math here first. So the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget, I don't always agree with everything they put out, but they did some math on this. And, you have Trump saying, hey, we're going to pay $2,000 a person. That's a lot of money. And we're also going to pay down the federal debt. While it is true that tariff revenue has grown this year because of the president's policies, do we have anywhere near enough tariff money to actually make this idea come to reality?
Well, not even close, frankly, which is amazing because, as you mentioned, the tariffs actually are raising quite a bit of revenue because of these high rates that President Trump has slapped on just about every country in the world. It's hard to estimate exactly how much revenue is likely to be raised by tariffs in this first year because President Trump keeps changing the rates just about every day. But the best estimates seem to suggest it'll be about $300 billion over the course of the year. And yet, this plan that he has just announced to rebate some of that revenue, if it is in line with, for example, the COVID stimulus checks, which most people think is kind of the mold that he's using for these rebates. And we can make some assumptions like by middle and low income, he means people earning less than $75,000 a year or so. And he's going to pay these rebates annually. Then probably it would be about $600 billion a year for those rebates. So I think listeners can do the math there. The rebates are supposed to cost about twice as much as is likely to be raised by all of the tariff revenue that Trump is currently on course to collect. And so when he said that we're going to use what's left over to pay down the national debt, actually, this is something that is going to explode the national debt because only half of it would be covered, and you would have to be borrowing or dipping into other revenue sources in order to pay those checks out. And so it seems as if President Trump is completely backwards on this issue, and is potentially floating something that, if it ever came to pass, which we can all hope that it doesn't, would be a huge budget buster for the federal government.
Yeah, you got to love that Washington math, which sometimes gets even more confused in the White House. Alicia, something else I'm confused about here beside the math. Trump is bragging there in that clip, essentially about a revenue boom from these tariffs. But that strikes me as going entirely against the argument his own Solicitor General made last week, for the purpose of defending these tariffs in front of the Supreme Court as the High Court decides whether or not they can stand. John Sauer, correct me if I'm wrong, he said these weren't about revenue, correct?
Well, that's right. So the administration argued in this case that it has authority under this 1977 law known as IEPA to impose tariffs at any time at whatever rate and basically whatever reason it wants on any country, so long as it declares a national emergency. Now, this runs right into the problem of, well, the Constitution gives Congress the taxing power, and tariffs are fundamentally taxes. The Constitution also gives Congress the power over foreign commerce, which it can, to some extent, delegate to the president, as it has in certain cases, delegating the president the authority to enter in certain trade agreements or negotiate certain trade agreements or to impose tariffs for discrete reasons or after conducting or going through certain procedures. Now, the problem here, again, is that the power to tax lies with Congress. Now, the administration doesn't want or tried to argue that, well, these aren't really taxes. These are, quote unquote, regulatory tariffs, not intended to raise revenue. So they're not taxes. They're intended to regulate commerce. And there's a long and historical tradition of Congress delegating some authority to the White House or the executive to regulate commerce, including to impose embargoes. But as you just heard, and we no doubt find clips or sound bites going back many months ago, the president also views this as a big revenue cow for the government. The White House has projected that the tariffs would raise $3 trillion over 10 years. Now, I'm a little suspect about that, in part because, tariffs are taxes, and what they tend to do is they tend to suppress activity. So they will reduce trade, and they probably won't raise as much money as anticipated. Nonetheless, they have insisted that this will be a huge windfall for the government and, to Monet's point, will help pay down the national debt. And so they're kind of speaking out both sides of their mouth, or telling the court one thing and then telling the American people another.
Right. So just to make sure I get this correct, the argument in front of the court is this is entire regulatory. In a perfect world, it wouldn't be raising any money at all. And yet turning around and telling the American people, this is all about raising a lot of money.
Well, that's exactly it. Trump wants to make the people think that, this is the tariffs are unalloyed good for the American people. They'll create all these millions of jobs. They'll produce all this money for the government that will help pay down the deficit. And now they'll create dividends. Money grows on trees. Essentially, and they'll be able to send out these $2,000 checks to the American public. One other point that I would point out is, if they were to actually do this, which I don't think they have the authority, because the appropriations power also lies with Congress. So the Congress would also have to appropriate the money for these quote unquote dividends. This would actually be inflationary, very similar to the Biden COVID stimulus checks, and this would actually probably do much more to raise prices than even the tariffs would.
Yeah. So, Monet, that's my other kind of issue with this, is the policy mechanism of it. Is it essentially it's redistributionary, right? You've got a lot of people out there right now that, in essence, because as you have both noted, tariffs are essentially taxes. So people right now are paying more for cost of goods. All that money is going somewhere. It's changing lots of different hands. Maybe it's coming back to the U.S. government. And now the Trump administration is going to divvy it all up and give it to some people, although not to others, as he pointed out in that tweet he sent out, that it's not going to go to high income people. Who knows what the cutoff would be in the White House's mind to make that math work. I mean, what we know from good, solid economic policy is one of the best ways you actually boost economic growth, if you want to look at sort of making sure people have more money in their pockets, is allowing them to keep more of the money they earn rather than taking a pot of it and sending it back out to everyone. So I guess I'd be curious to hear what you think about that from a policy perspective. But also, do you think, how would this land politically? Is this something that's likely to get the White House much credit if those checks were to head out the door?
Well, to handle the politics first, I do think that the American people understand that essentially what President Trump is proposing is taking a dollar out of their left pocket and then sticking it back in their right. That essentially these tariffs are taxes that are being placed on items that they buy every day, whether that's because they're importing goods from overseas or because companies in the U.S. that are buying materials from overseas then have to include that tariff in the price when they sell to American consumers. So people know that tariffs have already increased the price of goods. And if they get a rebate, that essentially is the government giving them back some of that money, perhaps with some borrowed money tacked on, which the American people are also going to pay for in the form of higher taxes or something like that down the road. So I think that Democrats actually would be able to make that case publicly and mute whatever some of the political upside of just giving free money to people would be. But on the policy, I think you're right that President Trump would not be helping the American economy by just essentially giving money to consumers. It's interesting because one of the cases that he and his administration make about the tariffs is that they're going to inspire an American manufacturing boom, that basically we're going to shield American companies from being undercut by Chinese exporters and by other foreign exporters. And so they're going to finally be able to invest and create jobs. And yet we've seen the opposite take place over the course of the past few years. Investment in manufacturing is anemic. Jobs are being shed. And President Trump hasn't actually really done anything, except, there were some things like full expensing in the One Big Beautiful Bill. But generally, tariffs haven't had that effect of promoting domestic investment. And so it seems as if he isn't necessarily putting the economy on a strong footing for the future with these tariffs, despite the fact that he claims to be doing so.
Well, let's turn to another idea that's come out of the White House just lately, the 50-year mortgage. And here's the president talking about it on Fox News recently.
It's not even a big deal. I mean, you go from 40 to 50 years, and what it means is you pay something less from 30. That some people had a 40, and then now they have a 50. All it means is you pay less per month. You pay it over a longer period of time. It's not like a big factor. It might help a little bit. But the problem was that Biden did this. He increased the interest rates, and I have a lousy Fed person who's going to be gone in a few months.
30, 40, 50. And, I kind of love the president just sort of saying, like, here's my bigger problem is there was a crummy last president. My Fed guy won't do what he wants. So we'll just do a 50-year mortgage. So, Monet, here's my question, though. Who would want a 50-year mortgage? I mean, how is this ever a good idea? And, I'm just trying to think this through. Let's just say you were like one of the incredibly rare, capable, put together 20-year-olds who's ready to go out and just buy a house at that age. So what, you finally own it when you're 70, when you retire? But also, again, the math here, it strikes me that this is one of these deals that it almost seems like a terrible customer ripoff, in that from my look at interest rates and the likely mortgage rates of this, that most you might get a very tiny reduction in a payment in return for paying a fortune in interest over those years. But walk us through the rationale of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, you posed the direct question of who would want a 50-year mortgage. And I think the unfortunate, very scary answer is that a lot of people would, because they would compare their monthly payment on the 50-year compared with the 30-year and be think, okay, I can afford to get into this house tomorrow. That theoretically, if I were going to do a shorter loan term, I would have to wait 5 more years to save up to make a larger down payment and reduce that monthly payment. And so I think a lot of people are going to leap at that. The problem is that just in the way that people who buy cars on a really long term or people who take out really big student loans, you're signing yourself up to pay a lot more interest over the lifetime of that loan. And so essentially, if you take, for example, a 30-year mortgage and a 50-year mortgage at the current interest rate of about 6.5% on a home, going for the 50-year means you're going to be paying almost double the amount of interest over the lifetime of repaying that loan. And that's value that you're not getting anything back for, that you're paying essentially for the privilege of being able to borrow. And so it would be very rough for the economy as a whole to have so many people so deeply indebted. But it would be a boon, obviously, to people who just want to sell as many homes as possible. And you would have Fannie and Freddie, of course, buying up a lot of those mortgages, which means that implicitly the U.S. taxpayer is backing a lot of that bad debt. And so I think President Trump is right in sensing that there is some political appeal of it because people can't afford to buy homes. A lot of people want to leap quicker to be able to get into the home that they can't afford today but would like to. But there would be a lot of financial peril for those individuals and for the U.S. economy as a whole down the road.
Alicia Monet makes a really good point here, and I was being a bit amused by this, but the reality is we should applaud the fact that, Americans owning a home is still part of the American dream. Things have been very, very rough for those who want to be in the home housing market because of high interest rates and very high mortgage rates. And I can see that this indeed might be attractive to a number of people if it meant that they might finally have an opportunity to do that. Maybe just that little bit less a month in payments would be enable them to finally get in there. But Monet also makes great points about the perils of this for many of those same individuals. You've written about this before. I mean, this is an idea that is mostly loved by mortgage bankers and by home builders. Explain a little bit why.
Well, it essentially props up and pushes up demand by reducing the mortgage payments at the margin. And now most people would say probably about $200 or $300 a month, but in some ways that would actually allow them to qualify for bigger mortgages because when you underwrite mortgages, you have to consider a borrower's debt to income ratio. Many borrowers are kind of pushing up against the upward limit, and they've already been stretched over the last several years or actually going back probably a decade now under the FHA and FHA standards. So in a way, it would actually probably push up home prices and accomplish the opposite of what the administration is doing. And then you can see that through all the other programs that the government has implemented, especially during the pandemic, to enable housing to become more affordable by helping borrowers qualify for bigger mortgages than they can really afford based on their incomes. The other problem is the borrowers are going to be slower to build equity. Now, the left or liberals point out, well, that's a problem for income inequality. In terms of housing is a key source of wealth accretion. All true. But the other issue is if home prices start to fall in some places, borrowers are going to be much more quicker to fall underwater. They're going to owe more than their house is worth. And you saw that happen during the post-bubble day or right as the housing bubble began to collapse. And they walked away from their mortgages. Strategic defaults. And you're actually starting to see that with auto loans right now because the terms have been extended for many less qualified borrowers. They have 7-year terms, and usually it's not unusual to become underwater necessarily on an auto loan, because autos and cars do depreciate fairly quickly, but it becomes more common and it becomes a bigger problem on a longer term loan in which the borrower actually hasn't paid down much principal. They've paid mostly interest. And so then they go to trade in, or they experience financial problems, and then they essentially they get their car repossessed, and the lender is out of a lot of actually money. In this case, the parallel would be, well, it's not really the mortgage lender, the mortgage makers are out of money. It's going to be the Fannie, Freddie, and FHA, the taxpayers.
Let's do one more here. The other big idea, cheaper hamburger. We just found out the Trump Department of Justice is now investigating the country's largest meatpacking companies for supposed collusion and price fixing. This is, of course, in response to high meat prices. Mene, it strikes me, this is normally the kind of move you see from Democrats. Whenever there's prices in the industry, they automatically default to, well, the industry is fixing prices, whether that be the gas industry or, the meat industry, et cetera. We now have the Trump administration going down the road. However, my memory is that past efforts to kind of break up these companies' holds on their industries or engage in these investigations have never really turned up much or gone anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's straight out of the Democratic playbook from the past couple of election cycles. Joe Biden with the oil companies just after the Ukraine war broke out, basically saying they're price gouging. That's the reason why gas prices have increased so much. And of course, that they never were able to prove or substantiate that. Kamala Harris did the same thing during her campaign with groceries and saying that she was going to launch investigations into groceries and potentially block mergers there because the grocery companies and stores were gouging people supposedly, when it turns out that that's an extremely competitive and very low margin business. And there was no way that the companies had the leverage to be able to jack up prices just to pad their profits in the way that Democrats allege. So it's certainly disappointing to see President Trump just picking up that line and running with it. But the truth of how beef prices have risen in the United States shows the same kind of flawed logic about tariffs that President Trump was exhibiting when we talked about the rebates, in the sense that he has raised tariffs on a lot of these companies or a lot of these countries from which the United States imports a lot of its beef. That allowed U.S. ranchers and beef producers here to raise their prices. And then he turned around and blamed those companies in the U.S. for raising their prices, and then says we have to import more Argentinian beef to bring those prices down, which is not to say that there aren't other factors at play here. Of course, there are problems in Mexico, for example, which produces a lot of beef. They've had some illness among their cows, and so the amount that they're able to supply to the U.S. market has diminished. That's one of the reasons prices have gone up, but Trump has been working at cross purposes, imposing tariffs on foreign beef, which obviously increased the domestic price, and then trying to offset that by saying, let's import more foreign beef. And so he seems to be tangled up in his own tariff logic yet again.
Yeah, and of course, Alicia, that president's decision to suggest that we import more Argentinian beef at a lower tariff rate, expand the quota, has managed to do little more than get him sideways with a whole bunch of Republican senators who represent ranchers out there, suggesting that maybe the politics isn't that good of this either.
The problem is, or one of the biggest, Mene alluded to this, is there's a screwworm parasite that's infected some Mexican cattle. And that was one of our major sources of imports. Now, the Agriculture Department in May banned all imports of Mexican cattle to the U.S., and a lot of U.S. slaughterhouses rely on that. Therefore, I just want to point out that their margins have actually decreased because they're having to pay more for cattle prices. Cattle prices have gotten up 25%.
Right.
Right. So the farmers are actually benefiting from all this. And Mene mentioned that. And so they actually are not only they're opposing an increase in Argentinian beef, the quotas, but they also are pushing the Agriculture Department to continued the ban probably more longer than it is necessary. And they want extra tariffs. They wanted the president to use his Section 232 authority to under national security to impose tariffs on foreign beef, as if, Brazilian beef is some kind of a threat to the homeland here. But the politics are tricky, to your point, because the president is having trouble with his in the heartland with farmers because of retaliation, particularly by China, but other countries as well, to his tariffs, and they've been suffering because of that. So he's trying to placate the ranchers in some ways, but realizes that that actually is hurting the American public too.
So my own suggestion after we've delved into all of these is that maybe what Republicans in Congress should do is focus on another reconciliation bill with broad-based tax reform, maybe do something to fix Obamacare, and maybe the president should think about pulling back from some of these tariff pretzels that we've been wrapped into. But that's just my own little tiny insignificant advice. Thank you, Monet. Thank you, Alicia. We want to thank all of our listeners. If you like the show, we are here every day. We'll be back tomorrow. You can hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at pwpodcast@wsj.com. On yesterday's podcast, we noted that 8 Democratic senators advanced the bill to end the shutdown. To clarify, it was actually 7 Democrats and 1 independent.